Welcome back, Fosun family. I hope all your weeks have been great and full of joy. Today we'll be in 2 Kings 13 and we'll be looking through this whole chapter. But before we jump into this chapter, it might be important to see what has led up to this point. In 1 Kings 11 through 12, following King Solomon, Israel splits into two kingdoms. We have the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern, which is Judah. The northern kingdom right away went off track under Jeroboam, who set up golden calf worship at Bethel and Dan. From that point on, every northern king is evaluated by one phrase: he did not turn away from the sin of Jeroboam. Later, we see God raise up Judah. Judah ended up destroying worship, but he still kept Jeroboam's false system. God promised his dynasty 4 generations on the throne, not because they were righteous, but because God is faithful to his word. This leads us to where we are now. We can dive into 2 Kings 13 now. Chapter 13 opens with Jehoahaz ruling Samaria. The verdict of his life is simple. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and followed Jeroboam's sins and didn't turn away, like we see in verse 2. This makes the Lord angry, and not just angry, but tells us that he burned with anger. If we think that our parents burning with anger is bad, just imagine how bad it would be with God. So, for their punishment, he handed Israel over to Hazael and his son Ben-Hadad of Aram. This is important because Israel still had a king and a name, but they were politically crushed. They became dependent. You see, God never erased them or took them out of his sight. He humbled them. This is justice. If you allowed your child to continually disobey you, would you still allow them to disobey you, or would you punish them? This is what God is doing here, so they can learn from him. God is not a passive observer of sin. He is a lawgiver, and laws without consequences. What would those laws mean? Israel's idols weakened them spiritually, and God allowed this to show in their physical and political lives. Sometimes we ask, why would God allow hardship? And this passage answers the question that discipline is not rejection, but rather is God's mercy in disguise. Going back to the passage, we see in verse 4, it's surprising. We see Jehoahaz pleading with the Lord, and the Lord listens to him. If we were in the Lord's spot right there now, our sinful selves would reject him. But we don't see the Lord doing this because he is good and perfect, and the Lord listens. Jehoahaz is not an activist. He did not tear down idols or lead a revival. His prayer did not mark a transformed life, but God heard him. Why would he do this? Why would God listen to him if they're just gonna keep on sinning, which we have seen? Because God saw Israel suffering and saw how terribly Aram was oppressing them. God hears the cry of his people. When we cry to God, he hears us. When we feel alone, isolated, depressed, or whatever it might be, God hears our cry. His loving heart wants us to embrace us as we cry on his shoulder, like a father and a child when he scrapes his knee. Because God listens to Jehoahaz because of his compassion, not because he was worthy. So God sends a deliverer. We're not told who it was, but this pattern sounds familiar. In Judges, we see a cycle of serving the Lord, Israel falling to sin, Israel is then enslaved, Israel cries out to God, God provides a judge or a deliverer. Israel is delivered, they go back to serving the Lord, then they go back to sin, and so on and so forth, just this repeated cycle. But we see this in the kings as well. God let them be humbled. They cried, and he came to rescue. This is God's grace, something that we don't deserve. God gives it to us. He does this out of his love for us. In verse 6, we possibly see one of the saddest verses in this chapter. As we see, they did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. Can you believe these people? Because God, 1, answered their prayers, 2, sent a deliverer, and 3, showed mercy to them. And they still didn't repent. In reality, it's easy for us to judge them for them being blind. But in reality, we can fall into the same cycle as well, of falling back into sin. But God still shows us mercy. God works in us, saves us, and then we turn right back into sin. It's just like sheep. They're not the brightest animals, but to help demonstrate, I encourage you to go on YouTube. And there's this video of the sheep that gets stuck in a crack. And someone comes and helps them out, and they get it out. And the sheep gets excited and jumps around because it's free, and then it falls back into the crack. Again, I encourage you to look up on YouTube because this is a great demonstration of this almost. Anyway, verse 6 is a warning. Experiencing God's help is not the same as surrendering to God's rule. God even rescued Israel's army to almost nothing, as only 50 horsemen remained. Israel's weakness was both natural and divine, as their distance from God made them weak. And God allowed this to happen as discipline. They received grace, but they refused to change. I wonder if any of us have done this in our lives, where God shows us grace, but we feel content in our lives, where we feel like we don't want to change, or feel like we don't need to change. We see the story start to shift to the next king, King Jehoshaphat. And this prophet Elijah, who was a successor of the prophet Elijah. We see Elisha is really sick and about to die. And the king is weeping and crying out the same words that Elisha cried out when God took Elijah. My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. The king realizes something that many people miss in this. That Israel's strength wasn't in its army, because they only had 50 horsemen. Rather, it was in God's presence through the prophets. Elisha gives the king a strange command to shoot an arrow out of the window towards the east. If I were in the king's shoes right now, I'd be so confused. You want me to shoot an arrow out the window? Okay. But what this arrow represents is that God's victory over Aram. But that's not at all what he tells him to. That's not all what he tells him to do. Elisha also tells him to strike the ground with the arrows. No amount, no context on why. Again, if I was in the king's shoes, I'd be lost and probably start questioning Elisha. And, I mean, who wouldn't? But we see the king doesn't do this. And he strikes the ground 3 times and then stopped. This made Elisha angry, as he says, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you would defeat it only 3 times. Excuse me? Why didn't you just tell me to do it 5 or 6 times then, if it was something that big, where we could just defeat this army? You see what we miss is that small acts of obedience can carry huge consequences. To the king, it probably meant meaningless, symbolic action. But the truth is, God had tied national victory to the simple act of faith. Sometimes we miss God's greater work because we treat the small acts of obedience casually. We often overlook the little thing that builds our foundation, if that's reading the Bible, or worship, or prayer, whatever it might be. The little acts. C.S. Lewis quotes that small acts of obedience act as seeds that grow victories you never dreamed of. So back to the story, or the passage. So Elisha dies, and these raiders come. And no, I'm not talking about the Northwestern College raiders. In a hurry, people throw this random dead man into Elisha's tomb. When this body touches Elisha's bones, this dead man comes to life. The Bible doesn't explain how or why this happens, but silence is important in this. The powers weren't in Elisha's bones, but rather it was with the power of God, who is demonstrating, hey, my power is still here. It's not dead just because my servant has died. God's work never depends on one human leader, since God is God and can work in whoever he wants. If you look at me in verse 23, this is the verse of the chapter here. But the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion and showed concern for them because of this covenant with Abraham, or because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To this day, he has been unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. God was gracious to Israel and had compassion on them because of his covenant with Abram, that we see in Genesis. Israel 100% deserved judgment and God's wrath, but God keeps his promise. Even when people don't, God keeps his promise. It might not look like it right away, but God keeps his promises. An example is that the Israelites, that God told them that they're going to be in the promised land they're going to be in the promised land, but they were in Egypt and they were in slavery for 430 years. That would be easy to throw God out the window and say that God has abandoned us, he has left us. Not everyone saw the promised land, but the Israelites still came to the promised land. To end this chapter, Jehoshua defeats the Aram exactly 3 times, just like what Elisha told him. God is not only gracious, but he also is a just lawgiver whose words never fail. This chapter shows us a God who holds 2 truths together. One, that he is gracious, he hears our cry, sends help, and shows mercy when we don't deserve it at all. But we also see on the other hand that he is just. Sin has to have consequences, and disobedience still weakens us. Half-hearted faith limits what we experience in the full experience of God. The tragedy of this is not that God failed them, because he never fails, but instead the tragedy was that they experienced God's grace and still refused his rule. Will we only cry out to God when we are desperate, or will we fully turn to him? The same God who disciplined Israel is the same God who listens to our cries today. I challenge us this week that we may not cry out to God only when life hurts, when we're struggling, but cry out to him when life is normal and everything is going well, and not overlook the small acts of obedience.